Hello and welcome to Session 5 of Decolonising the Body, the 2021 Decolonial Summer School Programme. So in last week's session, we were lucky enough to have Dr. Raul Rao come and speak to us about decolonising sexualities. This week, we're going to turn to the question of race. What is race? What is racism? And why is it important for a decolonial project? So for many decolonial thinkers, race is at the heart of issues of coloniality. And certainly this is the argument that the Peruvian decolonial thinker Anabel Quijano makes when he talks about the idea of the coloniality of power. So there are debates still about whether or not it was through the processes of colonization and particularly the transatlantic slave trade that ideas of race and racial difference and racial hierarchy were established, or whether these ideas of racial hierarchy were actually the justifications that were used in order to allow for colonization and slavery. Regardless of which one came first, what we do know is from at least the 19th century on, ideas of race are really crucial to the colonial project. And if you want to hear more about that, I'm going to make another recording where I speak more about the relationship between sexuality, coloniality, and race. But for now, let's say that one of the dark sides of Western science has been the development in the 19th century of the racial sciences. So this is a series of experiments that are done by scientists in Europe to establish fundamental differences between people based on biology and physiognomy, so physical appearance of the body. These experiments were often done on colonized peoples and other marginalized groups, and were often then used to justify and reinforce the idea of why certain people were incapable of levels of rationality, incapable of self-rule, and ultimately inferior to the standard human, which was, as we've spoken about in earlier weeks, essentially the white middle-class man. So these studies, through measuring of head sizes and brains, justified why there was an assumption that certain different racialized groups and colonized peoples were inferior. It was also used to justify why women were seen as inferior to men. And also even within European society, through research on apparently the criminal classes, there was also the use of science to justify why certain groups within European society were also deviant and inferior. And often that was associated with working classes. So much of and of course, the ultimate example that's given within the West of where racial science took us was the Holocaust and World War II. However, of course, it wasn't only the Nazis who were involved in developing this particular type of science. Having said that, as a result of World War II, what we see in the latter half of the 20th century is a lot of emphasis placed on trying to show the lack of validity that this racial science actually has, and to establish that in fact there is no such thing as race as a biological fact and marker of difference. Even though that has now been well established within science, we nonetheless see that racism continues. So this raises interesting and important questions about how on earth we are to understand and combat racism in the context of what might be called a post-race world. Some societies have said, we don't need to talk about racism anymore because there is no such thing as race. And yet we know that there are often circulating within societies sort of common sense understandings of how people are different, and often that difference is measured in terms of superior or inferior based on things like skin color and physical appearance. This has led to many thinkers and activists trying to move from ideas of race to talking about processes of racialization. So this is an idea of how people are made different and made into racial others through certain social and political processes. It's important here to say that this is not a straightforward process. While it's often associated with people of different skin colors, ethnic minorities living in the West, actually we can see that these processes of racialization have been used on a range of different groups in society. We've seen, so it's not only that indigenous peoples or African Americans or ethnic minorities living in Europe are racialized, but research has also shown that at different times other groups have also been racialized. For example, the Irish have traditionally been racialized both in the UK and in the US. Italians, when they first moved to Australia, were also racialized, even though for all intents and purposes they're European. We also see most recently, and this was a big part of the Brexit debate in the UK, the ways in which Eastern Europeans, even though physically they have white skin, have been racialized and often subjected to the same kinds of stereotypes and discrimination that other groups who moved to the UK in earlier generations were subjected to. I should also say that processes of racialization are not limited to the ways in which white people mark difference of others, but also that processes of racialization have been identified as operating outside of the West as well, and are also connected with other phenomena and markers of difference, such as caste and caste systems, such as class difference. And so in this week's session, what I want us to discuss, what I hope we will discuss, is how do we think these processes of racialization occur? Why do we think that they continue, even when we know that actually there is no such biological thing as race? And then, knowing that, what can we do in response to this issue? I will leave it there.